6 weeks after joining the Naval Medical Center, Emily Carter was already counting the days until someone decided she didn't belong. She wasn't the fastest nurse. She wasn't the loudest. She didn't bark orders across the trauma bay or throw equipment onto carts with military precision. She had one habit that irritated almost everyone around her. Before touching a patient, she explained what she was about to do. It added seconds to every procedure, seconds the trauma ward believed it couldn't afford. That morning, those extra seconds were about to become the reason an entire hospital would remember her name. Not because she made a dramatic rescue, not because she performed an impossible surgery, but because a wounded admiral, one of the most decorated officers in the United States Navy, would later stand before generals, surgeons, and hospital executives, point to the newest nurse in the building, and expose a truth that would destroy more than one career. If you've ever been told that kindness makes you weak, this story may change your mind. The trauma wing never truly slept. Even at 4 a.m, stretchers rolled through automatic doors, helicopters landed on the rooftop, phones rang, monitors screamed, people shouted medical terms so quickly they sounded like another language. Emily still felt like a visitor inside that world. 6 weeks earlier, she had transferred from a regional hospital in rural Indiana. Their patients often knew every nurse by name. Families brought homemade cookies during holidays. Doctors actually had time to sit beside a frightened patient for 2 minutes before surgery. None of that existed here. At the Naval Medical Center, every second belonged to the next emergency. Every delay had a price, and every mistake had witnesses. Emily understood that. She simply refused to believe speed and compassion couldn't exist together. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that opinion. Charge nurse Vanessa Holt had spent nearly 14 years in military trauma medicine. People respected her, feared her, obeyed her. She expected decisions in seconds, not conversations. The first week Emily arrived, Vanessa watched her introduce herself to an elderly veteran before placing an IV. The procedure took less than a minute. The IV went in perfectly. The patient even thanked her. Vanessa waited until several nurses were standing nearby. Then she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This isn't a nursing school simulation." Emily looked up. Vanessa folded her arms. "Patients don't need speeches. They need treatment." A few nurses chuckled. Emily simply nodded. "I'm almost finished." Vanessa smiled without warmth. "You'll learn." The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. The memory lasted much longer. Within days, Emily earned a reputation she never asked for. Too gentle. Too slow. Too emotional. People stopped inviting her to lunch. The experienced nurses exchanged knowing looks whenever she volunteered for difficult cases. One afternoon, Emily overheard someone whisper inside the break room, "She won't last another month." Another voice laughed, "I'll give her 2 weeks." No one lowered their voice enough to keep her from hearing. Emily never confronted them. Not because their words didn't hurt, because proving someone wrong was never the reason she'd become a nurse. Long before nursing school, Emily's younger brother had lost nearly all of his hearing after bacterial meningitis. She was 12, he was 8. She remembered watching doctors speak over him instead of to him. She remembered how terrified he looked when strangers grabbed his arms without warning. She also remembered something else. The first doctor who knelt beside his bed looked directly into his eyes, picked up a notebook, and wrote only 4 words. "You are safe now." Her brother had stopped shaking almost immediately. That memory never left her. Years later, it became the reason she chose emergency nursing. Fear, she believed, wasn't the enemy. Being ignored was. Monday morning began like every other shift. Coffee, patient charts, briefings delivered too quickly for anyone new to keep pace. Then the overhead speakers interrupted everything. Incoming military transport. Priority Alpha. Every conversation stopped. Priority Alpha meant one thing. Someone important. Someone critical. Vanessa accepted the electronic transfer file. She skimmed the first page. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Interesting. Very interesting. She quietly closed the file before anyone else could read it. Then, she looked across the nurses' station. Emily. Emily stood. Yes? I've got a patient for you. Several experienced nurses glanced toward one another. Nobody volunteered. Nobody asked questions. Emily accepted the tablet. The patient information seemed unusually brief. Male, combat injury, severe blood loss, chest trauma, high agitation risk. That was all. Something felt wrong. Transfer files were never this short. Is there more? Vanessa shrugged. Everything you need is there. One of the senior nurses looked away to hide a smile. Another suddenly found the coffee machine fascinating. Emily noticed. She said nothing. After Vanessa walked away, one young respiratory therapist quietly stepped beside Emily. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Something's missing. Emily frowned. What? I don't know. I saw Vanessa reading more pages. Before Emily could answer, Vanessa called from across the station. Transport arrives in 12 minutes. No sightseeing. The therapist stepped back immediately. Emily looked once more at the file. Something important had definitely been removed. But what? Instead of walking toward the trauma bay, Emily headed for the education cabinet. She ignored several puzzled looks. She opened an old supply drawer. Inside were laminated communication cards, rarely used. Dust covered the corners. She took them anyway. Then she found a small dry erase board. The marker attached to it barely worked. She replaced it with a fresh one. Finally, she grabbed a second whiteboard. Just in case. One of the nurses laughed. Planning to teach algebra? Emily smiled politely. No. I'm planning to communicate. More laughter followed. No one asked why. She returned to the patient file one final time. Buried beneath medication orders, almost hidden inside the nursing assessment, she found a single sentence. One sentence. Probably overlooked by everyone else, or deliberately ignored. Patient experiences profound hearing loss and severe combat-related hypervigilance. Unexpected physical contact may trigger defensive violence. Emily read it twice, then a third time. Everything suddenly made sense. The missing pages, the strange smiles. Nobody had forgotten. Someone had chosen not to tell her. Outside, the distant sound of helicopter blades echoed across the roof. Inside the trauma bay, equipment was already prepared. Blood units waited. Surgical staff assembled. Vanessa stood with folded arms near the observation window. Several nurses quietly gathered behind the glass, watching. Waiting. Almost expecting entertainment. Emily looked through the window. None of them were preparing to help, They were preparing to witness failure. She took one slow breath, picked up the whiteboard, and walked into the trauma room alone. Seconds later, the transport doors burst open. 2 Navy medics rushed inside with the stretcher, moving dangerously fast. The patient was enormous. His combat uniform had been cut open across the chest, fresh blood soaked through thick pressure dressings. His fists were clenched. His breathing came in short, violent bursts. But none of that was what caught Emily's attention. It was his eyes. They weren't looking at doctors, or nurses, or medical equipment. They were scanning every corner of the room, like a soldier expecting another explosion. One medic shouted something. The patient didn't react. Another reached for his shoulder. Instantly, the wounded officer drove his elbow backward. The medic crashed into a supply cart. Metal instruments exploded across the floor. Someone yelled, "Hold him!" Another voice shouted, "Prepare sedation!" The room erupted into chaos. Outside the glass, Vanessa never moved. She simply watched, waiting for the newest nurse in the hospital to lose control. Emily looked once at the frightened man struggling to breathe, then quietly set the whiteboard against her chest and stepped directly into his line of sight. The trauma bay became a battlefield. Monitors screamed. Metal trays clattered across the floor. Someone reached for the restraint kit. Another physician shouted for emergency sedation. None of it reached the wounded officer. He couldn't hear the alarms. He couldn't hear the shouting. All he could see was 6 strangers closing in on him at once. His breathing became even faster. His right hand searched desperately for something solid to defend himself with. Emily never looked away from him. She slowly raised both empty hands, palms open. No gloves, no needles, no sudden movement. She stopped nearly 6 feet away, far enough that he wouldn't feel cornered, close enough that he could read her expression. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Then, she uncapped the marker. Large black letters appeared across the whiteboard. "You are safe." The officer's eyes shifted from her face to the board, then back again. Emily waited. She didn't rush him, didn't wave the board, didn't step any closer. She simply allowed him to read. After a few moments, she added another sentence. "This is a hospital." The man's shoulders remained tense, but something inside his eyes changed. Not trust. Not yet. Recognition. For the first time since entering the room, he had received information he could actually understand. Behind Emily, someone whispered, "What is she doing?" Another nurse answered, "Wasting time." The attending trauma surgeon glanced toward Vanessa. "Do we stop this?" Vanessa folded her arms. No. She wanted responsibility. "Let her have it." The surgeon hesitated, then looked back toward Emily. He didn't interrupt. Emily wrote another sentence. "My name is Emily." She tapped her own chest, then smiled gently, not dramatically, not theatrically, simply enough that he could read her face. Next, she pointed toward the doctor, standing several feet behind her, then wrote, "The doctor wants to help your shoulder." She drew a rough outline of a human body, circled the left shoulder, added a small question mark. The wounded officer stared at the drawing. His breathing was still uneven. Blood continued soaking through the dressing across his chest. Time was running out. Finally, very slowly, he nodded. It was almost impossible to notice, but Emily saw it. She looked over her shoulder. He understands. Nobody moved. The surgeon frowned. You're sure? Emily nodded once. He gave permission. She quickly wrote again. The doctor will touch your shoulder. 3 seconds. She lifted 3 fingers. 3, 2, 1. The surgeon carefully examined the wound. The officer flinched, but he didn't strike anyone. Emily immediately wrote again. Good. You are doing great. The officer looked back at the board. Then, for the first time, his clenched fists slowly relaxed. Outside the observation window, the laughter had disappeared. The nurses who had expected a disaster now watched in complete silence. One whispered, "She actually calmed him." Another quietly answered, "No, she let him calm himself." Even Vanessa stopped pretending not to pay attention. The trauma surgeon worked quickly. Laceration extends farther than transport notes indicated. We need imaging immediately. Emily translated everything. Every needle, every blood pressure cuff, every bandage, every examination. Nothing touched the officer until he knew it was coming. The process took longer, perhaps 30 extra seconds, maybe 40. No one measured. What everyone noticed instead was something far more important. No restraints, no additional injuries, no sedatives, no security officers. The room had transformed, not because the patient had changed, because someone had finally changed the way they spoke to him. While the physician prepared emergency imaging, Emily picked up another sheet of paper. She wrote carefully, "Can you tell me your name?" The officer accepted the marker. His injured hand trembled. Slowly, he wrote 2 words. R. Keen. Emily looked toward the transport paperwork. There it was, the pages Vanessa had removed. Rear Admiral Russell Keen. One of the youngest Rear Admirals ever promoted within the Navy. A decorated commander, recipient of multiple combat commendations. Emily looked back at the man sitting on the edge of the trauma bed. None of that mattered right now. At this moment, he wasn't an admiral. He wasn't a hero. He was simply someone terrified and bleeding. A few minutes later, the portable imaging technician arrived. As soon as Russell saw another stranger pushing unfamiliar equipment toward him, his breathing accelerated again. Emily immediately stepped into his line of sight. She wrote, "New person. This is an X-ray camera." Then she sketched a tiny machine beside a stick figure. Russell read it, looked toward the technician, then nodded once. The technician quietly whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." Emily smiled. "I have. My little brother lost most of his hearing when we were children." The technician blinked. "So that's why." Emily nodded. "He taught me something." "What?" "People aren't difficult when they understand what's happening. They become frightened when they don't." The surgery team arrived 20 minutes later. Everything was ready. The consent form lay on the tray beside Russell. Normally, someone would have explained the procedure verbally. Emily instead filled an entire page. She explained where the wound was, what the surgeons would repair, how long the operation might take, what risks existed, and finally, one sentence by itself. You have the right to say no. Russell read every line, twice, then looked directly at Emily. There was something different in his expression now. Not gratitude, respect. He picked up the pen, signed his name. Then, before handing the clipboard back, he wrote 4 words beneath his signature. Thank you for waiting. Emily smiled. It was worth waiting. He couldn't hear the words, but somehow, he understood them anyway. The operating room doors closed. For the first time in almost an hour, the trauma bay became quiet. Several nurses slowly returned to their stations. Nobody joked. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked at Emily the same way. One resident finally broke the silence. I've been here 7 years. I've never seen someone de-escalate combat trauma without medication. Another physician nodded. If we'd restrained him, he probably would have torn that wound open. The surgeon removed his gloves, then looked toward Emily. Good work. It was only 2 words, but in that department, they meant everything. Vanessa said nothing. She simply turned away and walked back toward the nurse's station. Her expression revealed almost nothing. Almost. Because for the first time since Emily arrived, someone else had become the center of attention. And Vanessa hated losing control of a room. She opened Russell's electronic file, read it again, then quietly closed the screen. Nobody noticed, except the respiratory therapist who had warned Emily earlier. He watched Vanessa leave, then glanced toward Emily. Something wasn't over. Not even close. If anything, it had only just begun. 2 hours later, the surgery was declared a success. The attending surgeon stepped into the hallway. The operation went well. Minimal complications. A quiet wave of relief passed through the staff. Emily smiled to herself, then headed toward the recovery unit. She carried something under her arm. Not medication, not paperwork. Another blank whiteboard. She had a feeling the first words Russell Keene would need after waking wouldn't come from a doctor. And somewhere down the corridor, Vanessa Holt was already typing the first sentence of an incident report that would soon place Emily's entire career in jeopardy. Emily arrived at the recovery unit nearly 30 minutes before Russell was expected to wake. She wasn't scheduled to be there. Technically, another nurse had already been assigned to post-operative recovery. Still, she found herself standing beside his room, holding a clean whiteboard and a handful of laminated communication cards. Old habits. Or perhaps something more. She remembered her brother's first night after surgery years ago. He hadn't awakened frightened because of pain. He'd awakened frightened because he had no idea where he was. She wasn't going to let that happen again. Russell lay motionless beneath warm blankets. Fresh dressings covered the long incision across his shoulder and upper chest. The ventilator had already been removed. Only the steady rhythm of the cardiac monitor filled the room. Emily sat quietly in the chair beside the bed. She wrote several messages before he ever opened his eyes. Your surgery is over. It was successful. She placed it aside. Then another. You are safe. Finally, she wrote one last sentence. It took her the longest. No one here will touch you without telling you first. She laid the board across her lap and waited. 47 minutes later. Russell's fingers twitched. His eyelids slowly opened. At first, his eyes wandered across the unfamiliar ceiling, then the walls, the IV tubing, the machines. His breathing immediately quickened. Emily stood, not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to enter his field of vision. She lifted the whiteboard. Russell focused, read every word, once, then again. His breathing slowed. The tension left his shoulders little by little. Finally, his eyes met hers. Emily smiled, then flipped the board over. "Welcome back." A faint, almost invisible smile appeared on Russell's face. Outside the room, 2 nurses watched through the observation window. "I've never seen him that calm." The other shrugged. "Maybe the sedatives are finally working." Emily heard the comment. She didn't answer, because she knew something they didn't. The calm had started long before anesthesia. For the next 2 days, an unusual routine developed. Every shift began the same way. Emily entered, she wrote a greeting. Russell nodded. Only then would the rest of the staff begin examinations. Without anyone officially deciding, the whiteboard had become part of the treatment plan. Doctors soon adapted. Physical therapists did too. Even the surgeons found themselves waiting for Emily to explain each procedure before they entered the room. To everyone's surprise, their patient became one of the most cooperative on the entire surgical floor. On the 3rd morning, the ward buzzed with unexpected activity. Black government SUVs rolled into the restricted parking lot. Military police appeared at every entrance. Within minutes, uniformed officers filled the hallway. A Navy captain hurried toward the nurses' station. "They're here." Conversation stopped. Everyone knew who they were. Senior Command. Vice Admiral Thomas Caldwell entered first. Behind him came several decorated officers. Hospital executives quickly emerged from their offices. Vanessa adjusted her uniform, straightened her parvisting, smiled. The smile Emily had never once received. Caldwell wasted no time. "I'm here to see Rear Admiral Russell Keene." "How is he?" "The surgery was successful," Vanessa answered confidently. "Our trauma team handled a very challenging admission." "Our team?" Emily quietly looked down at the chart she was updating. She said nothing. Inside Russell's room, the Admiral had already noticed the visitors. He couldn't hear the conversation outside, but years of military service had taught him how to read faces. He watched carefully, then looked toward the nurses' station, searching. Not for the officers, not for the hospital director. For Emily. She wasn't standing beside the executives. She was several yards away, restocking supplies. Russell frowned slightly. Something didn't feel right. Vice Admiral Caldwell entered the room. He greeted Russell warmly. The two exchanged a brief conversation using written notes. Caldwell asked a simple question. "Were you treated well?" Russell answered immediately. "Yes." Caldwell smiled, then wrote another. "Who took care of you?" Russell looked up. Without hesitation, he pointed toward the hallway, toward Emily. Caldwell turned. Vanessa stepped forward. "Our entire trauma team worked together," Russell interrupted by shaking his head. Firmly. He reached for the notebook again. His handwriting was slow, but unmistakably deliberate. "Not the team." He paused, then continued writing. "Her." He underlined the final word twice. The room fell silent. Caldwell glanced toward Emily. "You were the admitting nurse?" Emily nodded. Yes, sir. Before she could say anything else, Vanessa answered for her. Emily assisted under my supervision. We followed standard trauma protocol. Russell looked directly at Vanessa. His expression hardened. He picked up the pen once more. The next sentence appeared much more slowly, as if every word mattered. That is not what happened. Nobody spoke. Even the hospital director stopped taking notes. Russell continued. She was the only person who spoke to me. He crossed out the word spoke, then replaced it. Understood me. An uncomfortable silence settled across the room. Vanessa forced a smile. The patient was under significant stress. His memories may... Russell slammed the pen onto the bedside table. Not violently, just hard enough to stop everyone talking. He pulled the whiteboard Emily had used on admission closer. The same one, carefully stored beside his bed. The words were still there. You are safe. I will not touch you without warning you first. Russell placed his hand gently across those words, then looked at Caldwell. There were tears gathering in the corners of his eyes, not from pain, from memory. He slowly wrote another sentence. This saved my life. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered that Emily was too soft. For the first time since she'd arrived 6 weeks earlier, every eye in the trauma ward was fixed on the rookie nurse no one had believed in. Emily lowered her gaze, embarrassed by the attention. She had never wanted recognition. She only wanted her patient to feel safe. She assumed that would be the end of it. She couldn't have been more wrong. Because while the officers quietly thanked her, Vanessa Holt was already making another decision. One far more dangerous than assigning Emily a difficult patient. By the end of that afternoon, Vanessa would file an official report accusing Emily of violating trauma protocols, a report serious enough to recommend immediate termination. And this time, there would be no witnesses willing to stand beside her. Emily didn't hear about the report until the following morning. She was halfway through checking medication orders when Human Resources asked her to come upstairs. The request was polite. Too polite. Everyone in the trauma ward knew what that usually meant. As she walked across the department, conversations stopped. People avoided looking at her. Only the young respiratory therapist from her first day caught her eye. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Fear had spoken before courage could. The conference room felt colder than the hallway. At one end of the table sat the director of nursing. Beside him, an HR representative. A thin folder rested in front of Emily's empty chair. The director folded his hands. Please sit. Emily obeyed. The folder was pushed toward her. Across the top, she read the title. Professional Conduct Review. She turned the first page. Her stomach tightened. The report claimed she had delayed emergency treatment, ignored direct orders, assumed authority beyond her level of experience, placed a critically injured patient at unnecessary risk. She looked up. There must be some mistake. The director answered quietly. The report was submitted by charge nurse Vanessa Holt. Emily stared at him, then back at the pages. Every sentence described the same event, but almost none of it had actually happened. What happens now? HR answered. While the investigation is active, you are removed from Rear Admiral Keene's care. Emily didn't argue. What else? The HR representative hesitated. If the findings are upheld, Your probationary contract may be terminated. The room became silent. Emily slowly closed the folder, then asked only one question. May I continue caring for my other patients? The director nodded. Until the review concludes. Emily stood. Then I'd like to return to work. She picked up nothing, made no speech, didn't defend herself. She simply walked out. By lunchtime, everyone knew. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. Some believed Emily had frozen during the emergency. Others claimed she'd ignored a surgeon's orders. A few whispered she'd nearly killed an admiral. Every retelling became worse than the last. Only those actually inside the trauma bay knew the truth. None of them spoke. Vanessa had led that ward for 14 years. Emily had been there for 6 weeks. People did the math, then chose silence. The silence reached Russell's room before the truth did. When the morning nurse entered, he immediately looked past her shoulder. No Emily. He frowned. The nurse smiled awkwardly. She's working somewhere else today. Russell didn't believe her. He picked up the notebook beside his bed. His handwriting remained uneven after surgery. Where is Emily? The nurse read the question, then looked away. I don't really know. She left without another word. Russell stared at the doorway long after she disappeared. The next morning, he asked again. Different nurse, same answer. By afternoon, he stopped asking verbally. Instead, every sheet of paper beside his bed carried the same handwritten sentence. Where is Emily? Housekeeping noticed. Physical therapy noticed. Even dietary staff noticed. The notes quietly accumulated inside the room, like evidence, waiting for someone to understand them. Emily wasn't allowed anywhere near that hallway. Her assignments had been moved to another unit. Less critical patients. Routine recoveries. No trauma. No military cases. Officially, it was temporary. Unofficially, everyone understood what usually followed. Transfers, resignations, terminations. Late that afternoon, someone knocked softly on the break room door. Emily looked up. It was the youngest nurse on the floor, Olivia Brooks. She'd barely spoken to Emily before. Olivia glanced down the empty hallway before stepping inside. Without saying a word, she placed a dry erase board on the table. Emily recognized it instantly. It was the same whiteboard she'd carried into Russell's trauma bay. She picked it up carefully. The original message remained. Slightly faded, still readable. You are safe. Below it, written in shaky block letters, was a new message. Where is the person who saved me? Emily felt something tighten in her chest. When did he write this? This morning? Why are you bringing it to me? Olivia looked uncomfortable. Because he wouldn't stop asking. She hesitated. And because none of this feels right. Emily lowered her eyes toward the board again. For the first time since the investigation began, she realized she wasn't fighting to protect herself anymore. Someone else had been pulled into it. That evening, Vice Admiral Thomas Caldwell received an email. Attached were 2 documents. The first, Vanessa Holt's incident report. The second, the official surgical record. He read both, then read them again. Something didn't match. According to the incident report, The patient had been chemically sedated before treatment. According to anesthesia records, no sedatives had ever been administered before surgery. He frowned, then opened the electronic trauma log. Primary admission nurse, Emily Carter, not Vanessa Holt, not the trauma team. Emily Carter. He leaned back slowly. Someone wasn't telling the truth. The next morning, Emily was called back to Human Resources. This time, the folder waiting on the table was noticeably thicker. The HR representative spoke first. "We've completed the preliminary review." Emily remained standing. "The recommendation," the woman paused, "is termination of your probationary employment." The words landed softly, almost gently, which somehow made them hurt more. A resignation letter slid across the table. "If you resign voluntarily, the incident won't remain on your permanent employment record." Emily looked at the paper, then quietly pushed it back. "I won't sign." The director sighed. "You understand the consequences?" "Yes." "You could have difficulty finding another trauma position." "I understand." "Then why refuse?" Emily answered without hesitation. "I explained every procedure before touching my patient. I asked for consent. I prevented unnecessary restraint. I would do exactly the same thing again." Nobody replied. Outside the conference room, workers were arranging chairs inside the hospital auditorium. Banners had been hung overnight. Military officers continued arriving. The hospital was preparing a formal recognition ceremony honoring Rear Admiral Russell Keene's recovery. Programs had already been printed. One speaker's name appeared prominently. Charge nurse Vanessa Holt Emily's name appeared nowhere. She walked quietly back toward her locker, removed her family photograph, folded her spare uniform, placed everything into a canvas bag. She unclipped her hospital badge, held it in her hand, and wondered if today would be the last time she ever walked these halls as a nurse. At that exact moment, 3 floors above her, Rear Admiral Russell Keene was refusing to leave his hospital room. Not because of pain, not because of his surgery, but because he had just learned the nurse who taught him he was safe had suddenly disappeared. And for the first time since the explosion that nearly killed him, the calm inside him began to unravel once again. The hospital auditorium was nearly full. Rows of military officers sat beside surgeons. Hospital executives filled the front seats. Television cameras had been invited. Everyone believed they were about to celebrate the remarkable recovery of Rear Admiral Russell Keene. No one knew the ceremony was about to become something entirely different. Back in the Human Resources conference room, Emily still hadn't signed the resignation letter. The director of nursing pushed the document toward her one final time. "This is your last opportunity. If you resign voluntarily, you'll leave with a clean employment record." Emily looked down at the paper. For a moment, she imagined accepting it, walking away, starting somewhere new, leaving this entire place behind. It would have been easier, much easier. Instead, she slid the document back across the table. "No." The HR representative sighed. "May I ask why?" Emily answered quietly. "Because if I sign, I'm admitting that treating a frightened patient with dignity was misconduct." She looked each of them in the eye. "I won't do that." No one spoke. The room fell silent. Then, someone knocked on the conference room door. 3 slow knocks. The administrator frowned. "We're in the middle of a meeting." The door opened anyway. Vice Admiral Thomas Caldwell stepped inside. Behind him stood Rear Admiral Russell Keene. His left arm remained secured in a sling. His face was pale. Walking clearly caused him pain. Yet he had crossed half the hospital to be there. Everyone in the room stood, except Emily. She was too shocked to move. Russell carried something beneath his right arm, a whiteboard, the same one Emily had held in the trauma bay. The words were still there, slightly faded. "You are safe. I will not touch you without warning you first." He carefully placed it on the conference table, then looked directly at Emily. His eyes softened, only for a second. Then he turned toward the administrators. Vice Admiral Caldwell spoke first. "I requested access to the trauma bay security footage." Nobody reacted. He continued. "I also reviewed the medication administration records." The director of nursing exchanged a nervous glance with HR. Caldwell slowly opened a folder. "The two records tell very different stories." He placed several printed photographs on the table. Security camera stills. The first image showed chaos inside the trauma bay. Staff surrounding Russell. One medic falling backward, another reaching for restraints. The second image showed everyone stepping away. Only Emily remained in front of the patient, holding a whiteboard. The third image captured Russell lowering himself back onto the bed. Calm, no restraints, no struggle, no sedation. Caldwell looked toward the director. "The incident report states, chemical sedation stabilized the patient." He slid another document forward. "The pharmacy record confirms no sedative was administered." Another page. "The anesthesia log confirms surgery began with the patient fully cooperative." Another. "The admitting physician documented that verbal communication was impossible until written communication was established." He closed the folder. "The report filed against Nurse Emily Carter is factually inaccurate." Nobody looked at Vanessa, because everyone already knew. She slowly lowered her eyes toward the table. For the first time in 14 years, she had no authority left to hide behind. The director turned toward her. "Is there anything you'd like to explain?" Vanessa remained silent. The silence itself became an answer. Russell reached for the marker. His injured hand still trembled. Every word required effort. He slowly wrote beneath Emily's original message. "She stopped the war." Several people frowned. They didn't understand. Russell noticed. He placed the marker down. Then, using a voice rough from surgery, he spoke. Each word came slowly, carefully. "I wasn't fighting your staff." He paused to breathe. "I thought I was back on my ship." Nobody interrupted. "I couldn't hear. I couldn't understand. I saw strangers running toward me." His eyes drifted toward the whiteboard. "When she stood in front of me, she wasn't talking to a rear admiral. She was talking to the terrified sailor I had become." He looked directly at the director. "The surgeons repaired my body." He pointed toward Emily. "She convinced me to let them." The room remained perfectly still. Then Russell did something no one expected. He picked up the whiteboard once more, turned it over. On the back, he wrote another sentence. This time, the letters were larger, clearer, so everyone in the room could read them. No one saved me. He paused, crossed out the sentence, then wrote again. One person reached me. He underlined the final 2 words, twice. Outside, the recognition ceremony had already begun. Inside the auditorium, Vanessa's prepared speech was waiting on the podium. It praised teamwork, leadership, discipline. Not once did it mention Emily. Vice Admiral Caldwell looked toward the director. I believe this ceremony should be postponed. The director nodded immediately. I agree. No. Everyone turned toward Russell. He slowly stood, ignoring the pain. We shouldn't cancel it. Caldwell looked surprised. Why not? Russell smiled faintly. Because today, the right person deserves to be recognized. 15 minutes later, the auditorium doors opened. Hundreds of people looked toward the entrance. They expected hospital executives. Instead, they saw Rear Admiral Russell Keene walking slowly onto the stage. Vice Admiral Caldwell beside him. Emily several steps behind, looking completely out of place. Vanessa remained near the back of the room, alone. Russell accepted the microphone. He looked across the audience. Then, instead of beginning his prepared remarks, he raised the whiteboard. The same whiteboard, the one with 4 simple words. You are safe. He waited until every camera focused on it. Then, he quietly said, This is the reason I'm alive. The auditorium fell into complete silence. No applause, no whispers. Just hundreds of people waiting to hear what came next. And Emily still had no idea that the next words Russell spoke were about to change not only her career, but the way the entire Naval Medical Center would care for deaf veterans forever. The auditorium became so quiet that even the television cameras seemed afraid to move. Rear Admiral Russell Keene stood at the center of the stage. One hand rested against the podium. The other held the whiteboard. 4 simple words still covered its surface. You are safe. He looked across the audience. Doctors, nurses, hospital executives, military officers. Some had treated him. Some had never met him. All of them were waiting. Finally, Russell spoke. When people tell this story, they'll probably say a trauma team saved my life. He paused. They'll be partly right. His eyes moved toward the surgeons seated in the front row. The surgeons repaired the damage. The nurses stopped the bleeding. The operating room gave me another chance. He smiled gently. But none of that would have happened if one nurse hadn't convinced me to stop fighting. He slowly turned, looking directly at Emily. When I arrived here, I didn't see a hospital. I saw smoke. I saw fire. I saw men trapped below deck. I heard... He stopped himself. A faint smile crossed his face. No. I didn't hear anything. That was the problem. The audience remained completely still. I couldn't hear your voices. I couldn't understand your orders. I couldn't tell who wanted to help me and who wanted to hold me down. He lifted the whiteboard slightly. Then someone stopped trying to control me and started trying to reach me. Emily lowered her eyes. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Recognition had never been comfortable. She'd chosen nursing because patience mattered, not applause. Russell noticed. He smiled. "Stand beside me." Emily hesitated. Vice Admiral Caldwell nodded encouragingly. "It's all right." She slowly walked across the stage, stopping beside Russell. He handed her the whiteboard. "I think it belongs to you." She accepted it carefully, as if it were made of glass. Russell turned back toward the audience. "I've served nearly 35 years. I've received medals. I've commanded ships. I've trained officers. But I've learned something here that no military school ever taught me." He looked toward the younger nurses seated together. Fear doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like anger. Sometimes it looks like resistance. And sometimes it looks like the patient everyone has already given up on. His voice grew steadier. "If the first thing we see is defiance, we'll respond with force. If the first thing we see is fear, we'll respond with understanding. And understanding can save a life before medicine ever has the chance." No one applauded. Not yet. The silence itself carried too much weight. Then, Vice Admiral Caldwell stepped to the microphone. "I have one final announcement." He unfolded a single document. "Effective immediately, the Navy Medical Command will establish a revised communication protocol for deaf and hearing-impaired service members admitted under emergency conditions." Several administrators exchanged surprised looks. Caldwell continued. "The protocol was developed from recommendations submitted after Rear Admiral Keene's case." He smiled toward Emily. "And Nurse Emily Carter has agreed to serve as one of its clinical advisors." A murmur spread through the audience. Emily blinked. She hadn't agreed to anything. Yet. The director of nursing slowly walked onto the stage. He stopped in front of Emily. For several uncomfortable seconds, he said nothing. Then, in front of every employee, he extended his hand. "Nurse Carter, the disciplinary review against you has been permanently removed. The recommendation for termination has been withdrawn." He paused. "I also owe you an apology." Emily looked at his hand, then shook it. "You don't owe me one." He frowned. "I don't?" She smiled softly. "You owe the next patient." He looked confused. Emily continued. "If what happened here changes how we care for them, that's enough." The director didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded. "I understand." Vanessa Holt stood alone near the back of the auditorium. No cameras pointed toward her. No one confronted her. There was no dramatic accusation, no shouting, no public humiliation, only quiet consequences. Over the following weeks, an internal investigation confirmed that patient information had been intentionally withheld. The incident report had contained multiple false statements. Several nurses who had remained silent finally came forward, not because they wanted revenge, because they no longer wanted fear to make their decisions. Vanessa resigned before the investigation concluded. No one celebrated. Some simply felt sad. Years of experience had been wasted. The moment she stopped seeing patients, and started seeing obstacles. 3 months later, the trauma ward looked different. Every emergency bay now contained a communication kit. Whiteboards, picture cards, large print emergency phrases, translation tablets. What had once gathered dust in a forgotten cabinet now hung beside every crash cart. New nurses learned something during orientation that had never appeared in the training manual before. Explain first, touch second. It rarely added more than a few seconds. Those seconds changed everything. Emily joined the committee rewriting emergency communication procedures. She was the youngest person in the room, often the quietest. Whenever discussions became too complicated, she remembered her little brother. And one sentence: "You are safe." Sometimes, good policies begin with remarkably simple words. Russell eventually returned to active advisory duty. He couldn't command ships anymore. His shoulder would never fully recover. His hearing never returned. But he visited military hospitals across the country, not to speak about medals, or combat, or leadership. He spoke about vulnerability. At every lecture, he carried a whiteboard. People often asked why. He always gave the same answer: because one person cared enough to make sure I understood before asking me to trust. Nearly a year later, another emergency helicopter landed on the hospital roof. A young Marine was rushed into the trauma bay. Roadside explosion, partial hearing loss, extreme panic. One of the newest nurses reached instinctively toward the restraint cabinet. Another nurse gently stopped her. Without saying a word, she picked up a whiteboard. Emily watched quietly from the hallway. She didn't step in. She didn't need to. The young nurse walked into the room, raised the board, and slowly wrote, "You are safe." The frightened Marine looked up. Read the words. His breathing began to slow. Emily smiled to herself, not because they were copying her, because they no longer needed her to be in the room. The lesson had become larger than the teacher. People often believe courage is loud, that it announces itself with speeches or medals or impossible acts of heroism. Sometimes it does, but sometimes courage is much quieter. Sometimes it's choosing not to rush, choosing to see fear where everyone else sees defiance, choosing to give another human being one reason to believe they are no longer alone. Years later, if you ask anyone at the Naval Medical Center about the whiteboard hanging inside the trauma education room, they probably won't tell you it belonged to a famous admiral. They won't tell you about the investigation or the ceremony. They'll simply smile and repeat the lesson every new nurse hears on their first day. Before you treat the injury, make sure the person knows they're safe. Because medicine can heal a wound, but feeling understood is often what allows healing to begin in the first place.